you can see, my title for today's talk is Work, Play, Escape, Freedom and Submission in Video Games About Office Jobs. And here's a quick overview of what I will take you through today. And I think it will be a great contrast to what we just heard from Felix and Christoph, because they showed us all these nice landscapes, beautiful parks. And I will show you now dark office rooms where these video games I will mention will trap you in. And I will talk about the lack of freedom in these games. So it will be a lot of contrast, I think. And maybe I start with a little bit about myself and my research. As Natalie mentioned, I was planning to be there in person, actually. So I'm a little bit sad about not being there, but I'm still very happy that I'm able to present in this conference because the topic is also perfect for me. And I am a PhD student at the University of Freiburg. I'm focused from these disciplines. I'm interested in the case studies of games and analysis of games. And today's talk will also be a study that is analytical. And also in line with this, at the English department in University of Freiburg, I have a research group, a colloquium that I call Reading Games. And in this group, we discuss individual games each month. And to decide on which games, we usually decide on a topic first, and then we change this topic every 3 to 4 months. And at one point, I think it was 2 years ago, we talked about the topic of office core, what we call office core. So these are games about office jobs and games that simulate this kind of jobs. And I will also use this term just because it's shorter, the term office core. But yeah, that's not like a definition of a genre or anything. And we talked about some of the games. I can just show you as examples, if in case you're familiar with these games. I think the most popular one is probably Papers, Please. And these are all indie games. So if you're not familiar with these, a very broad definition of this group of games would be that they are about they take place in a simulated workplace and or a simulated computer screen. So it can just be the computer screen, or it can be the workplace plus the computer screen as the game environment. And the story of these games, not surprisingly, is about an often bureaucratic office job. An examination of these games that simulate office jobs is also by Bryce Jones in his article from 2017 called The Process Genre in Video Games in the Shadow of Papers, Please. Jones categorizes these games into what he calls the process genre, and is the term he adopts from Salome Aguilera-Seversky's work in film studies. And this term, the process genre, originally refers to films about the aesthetics of labor and completion of tasks. And while I see labor as an important part of these games, I think there are more to them, that something that can unite them apart from the simulation of a job and tasks of this job as part of gameplay. Thus, in the following slides, I will show you several examples of these games and explain how they deal with freedom and oppression from these 3 points of view. First one is the spatial perspective. So the spatial limitation of freedom, because the majority of these games take place in constrained and non-navigable aspect that is often ascribed to the success of Papers, Please, which was released in 2013. And it was very successful. And yeah, a lot of people think that the other games followed the political themes because of the success of this game. And these games tackle stories about political dystopias, authoritarianism or totalitarianism, and topics such as invasion of privacy and resistance movements. As you can see, a quick example of this in my screenshot from the game Orwell. Lastly, from a game design perspective, and maybe also user experience perspective, the freedom of choice, or rather the lack of it, is also investigated in my work. So I will briefly talk about this at the end of my presentation as well. An office space as the game world is an interesting choice to explore because, as Janet Murray argues, and I quote, digital games are spatial, and navigable spaces are one of the medium's strengths. However, the workplace as the game world is one that has little to no navigability, and it can limit the player's movement to great degrees. I have two examples here again. On top, you see a screenshot from Papers, Please. I can't see the audience, so I don't know how many of you are familiar with this game, but maybe I just quickly summarize the premise of it. So the game is about taking the role of a border inspector. And the game world and the entire interface of the game consists of the desk and the booth, the tiny area of the border inspector. And as you see in the screenshot, you have these documents that you need to inspect in the game. And this is all you see, basically. Maybe if you pay attention or if you know the game, you also see this small representation of people in the background, but that's more like a window and you can't really navigate this space. So you can only sit here and just interact with your documents. So it's very, very limited space. And sometimes this can also be replaced by a computer screen if the job is done on a computer. And sometimes, as I said before, it can also be both. I think one where the computer screen is the only interface can be seen in games like Orwell, which I just showed you in the slide before, or Her Story, if anyone is familiar with that game. And these games also work exactly like the older game Uplink. So the computer screen is the main interface. An example that combines these two and offers a little bit of navigation of the space is Beholder 2, the sequel to Beholder. And it's very similar gameplay-wise to Papers, Please. So you again inspect documents, but you do this on a computer. And I can also show you another screenshot from Beholder 2, where in this game you work in a ministry. Again, it's about working in this ministry and for an authoritarian government. And you can walk in this ministry, but the interaction with this environment is still very limited. And as you see, and as I mentioned in the beginning of the game, like this is like a very dark and limited space, very much unlike what we saw, like these beautiful landscapes in the presentation before. So you might think that the combination of this limited space and these bureaucratic tasks, which is what the story is about, can make the game sound very boring. And I think that's also an important and interesting aspect of studying these games. And I think a further reason why such constrained spaces merit particular attention is their subversive role in regard to the current discourse of metaverse and the common misconception of freedom as almost the holy grail of virtual worlds, along with immersion and, of course, the concept of fun. The two games I just used as my examples don't only put the player in these tight places without much freedom to navigate these places, but the premise of their narrative also does not sound like a fun activity. In Papers, Please developers Lucas Pope's own words, and I quote, "It's hard to describe the game and make it sound fun." According to Gordon Calleja, video games are the most common media to be associated with escapism due to two factors. Firstly, because of their virtuality and interactivity, and secondly, because, I quote, "a common perception of play and games as the opposite of seriousness and work." Thus, I think a close look into workplaces as game worlds especially those that we associate with even more seriousness, such as serious jobs, such as the government offices in my examples, can also help understand the relation between work, play, and escapism. Because I think the aspect of escapism is one that needs to be discussed, because I don't think the strict separation between virtuality and reality, as well as the understanding of fun, is not something we can define very easily. And I think this also relates well to yesterday's first keynote, where Harold emphasized that different players play games for different reasons. And I will talk about the appeal of these games near the end of my presentation again. But I think escapism is also an interesting aspect of these games, because it doesn't really offer that. And moving on, as I mentioned before, video games about office jobs tend to share a narrative about political oppression and authoritarian or totalitarian governments. A recent example of such a game is titled Not for Broadcast, which was fully released only in the beginning of this year, but it was released over the several years as episodes. And in this game, the player takes the role of a technical director working in a production control room for a live broadcast television program. So the tasks here are to manage the camera feed, select what is shown on the screen, and bleep full language. The government in Not for Broadcast's alternate version of the United Kingdom is shown as an authoritarian dystopian one that has recently won the election. And as the game proceeds, the government introduces new reforms, such as restricting the freedom of media, which requires the player character to censor not only profanity, but also anti-government statements on the news. Another interesting aspect of Not for Broadcast, which shows similarities to other office core games such as Paper Please, Orwell, or Beholder, which I mentioned before, is the player character's disempowerment in the beginning of the game. As the character takes the role of a technical director, he's completely inexperienced in this job, and yet he's given no choice but to learn the job from the former employee who flees the country and forces the player character to replace them in the very beginning of the game. As a result, in terms of the tasks, the gap between the knowledge of the player and the knowledge of the player character is minimized. While the only impact of performing tasks at work seems like the paycheck, and better performance at work affects the player character's pay, later in the game, it becomes clear that players' certain decisions can affect the public opinion and the other characters' actions, which in turn can lead to one of the 14 different endings of the game. Decision-making in Not for Broadcast is required during the player character's job in the broadcast room, as they can decide on which live feed to show and which advertisements to play during program breaks. And while the character has a great deal of freedom to choose in these sections of the game, failure to do some of the tasks, such as switching the camera angles during an interview or censoring sensitive content, affects the player's pay, so they will get paid less if they fail to censor everything that's required to be censored. And too many mistakes cause to fail the complete chapters, and similar rules can be seen in Papers, Please and Not Tonight, another game that's very much similar to Papers, Please in terms of gameplay. And in these games, it's also working similarly. So you can, as the player, intentionally or unintentionally make choices that are against the fictional job's requirements. However, too many mistakes or instances of disobedience make the player unable to proceed in the game. In Not for Broadcast, the players also asked to make choices outside of the workplace. The sections of the game that take place outside of the workplace show the character has a family, but these parts are shorter than the job simulation part of the game, and they are only represented with text-based narrative and multiple choice questions the players have to answer. The narrative in the sections change based on players' decision during the work sessions. So is the freedom of choice or the eventual power to impact the game's narrative what makes these games about seemingly boring jobs appealing for video game players? And again, as the keynote yesterday emphasized, different people play games for different reasons. And again, as Harold said, feeling agency and power can be one of the factors that make games appealing for some players, although it's definitely not the single reason and does not apply to every player. According to John's work on process genre in video games, these games' appeal come from a sense of Heidegger's workshop effect. As he explained, simplified versions of the task of the simulated jobs require the task that these jobs require, and the physical spaces, such as a desk where this job is performed, and the objects on this desk can create a familiarity through everyday life, such as the objects we use every day, like documents and passports, or through our familiarity with these objects in other media, so through transmedial storytelling. And therefore, these games with these tasks and objects on the screen can support a sense of involvement in the game. Moreover, when the simulated job is not performed at a desk, but on a computer screen, the distance between the player presence in the game world and the physical space become minimized as the player views a screen in both, and the physical screen, which Murray calls, I quote, a reassuring fourth wall, becomes a part of the virtual world. So I think it's also interesting when we are looking at a screen in both real life and in the game that the double screen almost removes the fourth wall. Lastly, the games I mentioned as my examples all include repetitive tasks as part of the work they simulate. While repetitiveness in games might have a negative connotation, it is also associated with submissions, which is one of the types of fun Marc Leblanc lists in MDA, a formal approach to game design and game research. Greg Kostikyan understands submission as a type of fun to be gained by accepting and committing to the rules and tasks in a game. So it's, I think, very fitting to this type of games where you're given these tasks and you have to do them and you don't even have the choice with the job that's selected for you. However, he also acknowledges that the manipulation as well as the understanding of the structure is part of the gameplay, and I think that is again fitting if we understand submission in the sense that we can also manipulate the rules and the structure of the game, because as I explained before, as players starts the game as a disempowered character, and they later try to work secretly against the government in many of these examples. In conclusion, in this study, freedom and oppression in video games about quote-unquote boring office jobs were examined from the perspectives of game design, spatiality, representation, and player experience. It was shown that while many of these games in this group comment on social and political aspects of labor and freedom by disempowering the player character, these games can still create involving and appealing game worlds and narratives in various ways. And that's all for my talk. Here are some of my sources, and thank you for listening.